You know, as I think about God's plan for each of our lives, I'm reminded of just how small our human perspective can be. So often we try to wrap our minds around life's twists and turns to make sense of the journey, and we think we've got it all figured out. We make plans, we set goals, we chart out the road we think we're supposed to be on. But friends, there's something important that we tend to forget. God's plan for us is so much bigger than we could ever imagine. His thoughts are higher than our thoughts, and His ways are higher than our ways. And while we're down here wrestling with the day-to-day realities of life, God has a perspective so vast, so infinite, that it makes our plans seem like a small puzzle piece in His grand design. Let me tell you a story, a true story, that beautifully illustrates this truth. Imagine a man named Joseph. Many of you know him from the Old Testament. Joseph was just a young man, a dreamer, with his heart full of hope and his eyes set on the future. God gave Joseph dreams, visions of greatness and purpose. But those dreams weren't fulfilled right away, and they didn't come without hardships. In fact, Joseph's life seemed to take a downward spiral the moment he began to share those dreams with his family. He was betrayed by his own brothers, sold into slavery, and taken to a foreign land, far away from everything familiar. I want you to picture what that must have felt like, being abandoned by those closest to you, stripped of everything you know, and forced into a life that was the complete opposite of what you had envisioned. Now, Joseph could have given up. He could have become bitter, resentful, angry at God for allowing his life to fall apart. But he didn't. He kept his heart open to the possibility that God was working, even in the darkness. He continued to trust, even when the circumstances were far from what he had expected. And in the quiet places of his heart, he held on to those dreams that God had placed within him, even when every part of his earthly reality seemed to contradict them. Joseph found himself in Egypt, in the house of a man named Potiphar, working as a slave. But Joseph didn't just go through the motions. He worked with integrity, with diligence, and with a heart of service. And the Bible tells us that God was with him, that even in this place of captivity, the Lord was blessing him. Potiphar noticed, and soon Joseph was promoted, given authority and responsibility. It was a glimpse of hope, a small step upward. But just when things seemed to be looking better, another hardship struck. Joseph was falsely accused, thrown into prison for a crime he didn't commit. Can you imagine that? Just when he thought he was finally rising out of the depths, he was knocked down again, thrown into a dungeon, forgotten and abandoned. But again, Joseph held on. He trusted that God's plan for him wasn't over. He didn't know how long he'd be there. He didn't know what lay ahead. But he kept believing that God was at work. And eventually, as we know, God did something miraculous. He took Joseph from that prison cell and placed him in a position of power, second only to Pharaoh himself. Through a series of divine appointments, Joseph was given the responsibility to save countless lives during a time of great famine. Friends, God's plan for Joseph was so much more than Joseph could have ever dreamed. I'm sure that if you had told young Joseph back in his father's house that he would one day be a ruler in Egypt, he would have laughed at the absurdity of it. But God saw what Joseph could not. God knew that He would use Joseph's life to change the course of a nation, to save His people, and to reveal His glory. So why do I tell you this story? Because each of us at some point in our lives faces moments that feel like the end. Times when we look around and all we see is pain, confusion, and loss. Maybe you're there right now. Maybe you're asking God why He's allowed certain things to happen, why your life looks nothing like you thought it would. And if that's you, I want to encourage you with this truth. God's plan is beyond what you can imagine. His love for you is deeper than any valley you might walk through, and His purpose for your life is greater than the setbacks you face. You may not understand why you're going through what you're going through, but trust that God does. And just like He did for Joseph, He is working all things together for good in ways you can't yet see. God isn't limited by our failures, by our weaknesses, or by our doubts. He is the creator of the universe, the author of life itself, and His plans are beyond anything we can conceive. So I urge you today, don't let the challenges of the moment make you lose sight of the greatness of God's plan. Hold on to the hope that He is with you, even in the darkest places. Trust that His ways, though mysterious, are always perfect. And remember, you are a part of a story that is greater, richer, and more beautiful than anything you could ever dream. God's plan is beyond what you can imagine, and if you trust Him, He will lead you into a future more glorious than you ever dared hope for. When we look at the struggles and trials that come our way, it's natural to wonder why they're happening. We ask God, why would you allow this hardship? Why this pain? Why this struggle? But I want to share something with you that may change how you view those difficult moments. Friends, our struggles are not just random, purposeless pains in our lives. In God's hands, our trials and hardships are part of a divine plan, a greater purpose, carefully crafted by a loving Father who uses every moment, every tear, every disappointment, every setback to shape us and prepare us for something far greater than we could ever accomplish on our own. The hard truth is this: we cannot grow into the fullness of God's purpose for us without walking through seasons of difficulty. Think about the life of Moses. Here was a man who was born into adversity. From the moment of his birth, he was faced with hardship, even before he was old enough to know it. As a Hebrew child in Egypt, he was supposed to be killed under Pharaoh's order. But God's hand was on Moses, and in a miraculous twist, he was not only saved, but raised in Pharaoh's own household. Yet even then, his life wasn't smooth or simple. When he came of age and chose to identify with his Hebrew people, he was met with rejection and conflict. After a heated encounter that led him to kill an Egyptian, he fled to the wilderness. Think about this. Moses went from the comfort and privilege of the palace to the isolation and obscurity of the desert. For 40 years, he lived there, tending sheep, a far cry from the life he had known, and certainly from the life he might have expected. It would be easy to imagine that Moses, in those long, silent years, questioned why his life had taken such a turn. Perhaps he thought that his potential was wasted, that he was forgotten, that God had no plan left for him. But oh, how wrong he would have been to believe that. In the wilderness, God was doing a powerful work in Moses. In those quiet, isolated years, God was preparing Moses for a purpose beyond anything he could have dreamed. The man who had fled Egypt in fear and shame would return to lead a nation to freedom. The shepherd in the wilderness would become God's chosen instrument to confront Pharaoh, to stand boldly before the most powerful ruler in the world and declare, "Let my people go." That kind of faith, that kind of strength isn't born in comfort. It's forged in the fire of hardship. It's shaped in seasons of waiting and wondering. God used Moses' time in the wilderness, not as a punishment, but as a preparation. Every challenge Moses faced, every moment of solitude, every doubt he wrestled with, all of it was molding him into the man God needed him to be for the task that lay ahead. I wonder if some of you here today might be in your own wilderness, a season that feels barren and hopeless. Perhaps you feel isolated, forgotten, or even abandoned. Maybe you've been asking God, why am I here? What is the purpose of this pain? And if that's where you are, I want you to hear this truth. Your wilderness is not a waste. God is not distant from you in these struggles. He is right there with you, working in ways you cannot see. He is using these challenges this very season to refine you, to strengthen you, and to prepare you for something greater. Just as He did with Moses, God often takes us through the wilderness to teach us lessons we couldn't learn anywhere else, to draw us closer to Himself, and to shape us into vessels that are fit for His purpose. And friends, here's the amazing thing. God doesn't just work in our lives despite the hardships. He works through them. Romans 8:28 tells us, we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love Him, who have been called according to His purpose. That verse doesn't say that God works only in the good things, or that He makes everything comfortable. It says that in the all things, the good, the bad, the painful, the confusing, God is at work, orchestrating a purpose that goes beyond what we can see. It's not easy to embrace this truth when we're in the midst of pain. But when we look back, we can often see how God used even the most challenging circumstances to bring about something beautiful, something meaningful, something that reveals His love and His faithfulness. Consider the story of Ruth, a young widow who faced deep loss and hardship. She could have given up, but instead she chose to follow God. In the midst of her sorrow, God was working, and her faithfulness led her to Boaz, to a new family. And ultimately, she became part of the lineage of Jesus Christ. Her pain and her faith were woven into God's divine plan. Just like Ruth, just like Moses, we too are called to trust that God's hand is upon us, even in the wilderness. The challenges we face are not meaningless. In fact, they are part of the journey that shapes us and draws us closer to Him. When we allow God to use our struggles, we find that He does not waste a single moment, a single tear, or a single trial. Every hardship we endure is an opportunity to experience His grace, to grow in faith, and to be prepared for the greater things He has in store for us. So wherever you find yourself today, I urge you to hold on to this hope. Your struggle is not in vain. God sees you, He knows your pain, and He is working, even now, to bring about something good. Just as Moses was transformed in the wilderness, so too can you be transformed by trusting God in your trials. Allow Him to work in your life, and you will find that He is indeed faithful. He will lead you step by step into the fullness of His plan, a plan that is far beyond what you could ever imagine. As we walk through life trying to make sense of God's plan, one of the greatest challenges we face is learning to trust and to wait. It's easy to say we trust God when everything is going smoothly, isn't it? But real trust, the kind of trust that deepens our faith and roots us firmly in God's love, is forged in the moments when we can't see the way forward, when we're asked to believe in His promises, even when our circumstances seem to contradict them. Patience and faith go hand in hand, and often God allows us to wait, not to punish us or to withhold blessings, but to prepare us and grow us in ways we can't yet understand. Friends, patience is not merely waiting. It's how we wait. It's the posture of our hearts during those seasons of stillness, when God seems silent and we're left to hold on to His word alone. And it's in those times that God is working behind the scenes, unfolding His perfect plan, step by step by step by step. Think of Abraham, our father of faith. God gave Abraham an extraordinary promise that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars in the sky. But this promise came with a call to wait, a journey that tested Abraham's trust and patience like nothing else. Year after year went by, and still he and Sarah were without a child. I want you to think about how hard that must have been for Abraham. In the natural, everything seemed impossible. He was old. Sarah was well beyond childbearing years. People around him might have even questioned his sanity, his faith, maybe even laughed at him. But Abraham held on to the promise. Scripture tells us in Romans 4:20, one, that he did not waver through unbelief regarding the promise of God, but was strengthened in his faith and gave glory to God, being fully persuaded that God had power to do what he had promised. Imagine the depth of faith it took for Abraham to hold on to that promise, to keep believing, year after year with no evidence that anything was changing. Abraham learned that trusting God often means waiting on his timing, believing that he is faithful even when we see no proof. You see, in those seasons of waiting, something miraculous is happening within us. When we wait in faith, we're not just sitting idly by. We're being transformed. Patience, as hard as it may be, is one of the tools God uses to refine our character, to draw us closer to Him, and to strip away our dependence on our own strength and understanding. As we wait, we are learning that God's ways are higher than our ways, and His timing is perfect. We may not always understand why He asks us to wait, but when we choose to trust, even in the silence, we're declaring our belief in His sovereignty, His wisdom, and His love. Let's take a moment to consider the Israelites wandering in the wilderness. After being delivered from Egypt, God promised them a land flowing with milk and honey. But instead of leading them straight there, He took them on a long, winding journey through the desert. Days turned into weeks. Weeks into years, and that promised land seemed further away than ever. Many of them grew impatient, began to doubt, and even longed to return to Egypt, the very place where they had been enslaved. Isn't it fascinating that they wanted to go back to the familiar chains of bondage rather than endure the discomfort of the unknown? God was teaching them to trust in His provision, His guidance, and His timing. Through the waiting, He was not only taking them to a physical destination, but also transforming them into His people, preparing their hearts to receive His blessing. They had to learn that God was their provider, that He would be the one to sustain them, to guide them, and to fight for them. Every day they spent in the wilderness was a lesson in trust, a test of faith, and an invitation to rely fully on Him. And isn't that exactly what God does with us today? There are times when the answers don't come, when the doors don't open, and when we're left wondering why we're still in the wilderness. But, friends, God is not in a hurry, and He doesn't waste time. If He has you waiting, it's because He is doing a deeper work in you, a work that goes beyond the immediate, beyond the visible, and beyond what we could even ask for. Waiting with faith refines us, aligns us with His will, and prepares us to step into His purposes with a heart that's fully yielded to Him. So, while we may be anxious to move forward, to see the fulfillment of our dreams and desires, God is focused on shaping us into the people who are ready to receive the blessings He has in store. Now, I know that waiting isn't easy. It's not easy to watch others move ahead while you're still in the same place. It's not easy to keep believing when the days turn into months and the months turn into years. But remember this, God is not slow in keeping His promises. His timing is always perfect, and His plan for you is good. Trust that He knows the desires of your heart, and trust that He is at work, even when you can't see it. One day, when you look back, you will see that every moment of waiting was worth it. You will see how He used that time to deepen your faith, to strengthen your resolve, and to prepare you for blessings greater than you could have ever imagined. So today, if you find yourself in a season of waiting, I urge you to embrace it as a sacred time. A time to grow closer to God, a time to grow closer to God, a time to let go of your own plans and surrender fully to His will. Because waiting is not just about patience. It's about trust. And when you trust Him in the waiting, you are declaring that you believe in His goodness, His faithfulness, and His power to bring about His promises in the perfect time. Let's choose today to wait with hope, to wait with faith, and to wait with the full assurance that God's plans are worth every moment of trust and every second of patience. Remember, His plan is beyond what we can imagine, and His timing is always, always right. As we continue to think about God's incredible plan for our lives, there's something crucial that we need to understand. Trusting in God's plan is not just a matter of saying the right words. It's a call to action. It's about stepping out in faith even when the path isn't clear. You see, faith and obedience are inseparable. They're two sides of the same coin. We can't just say we trust God and then sit back hoping everything will fall into place without any effort on our part. True trust in God moves us to act even when we're unsure of what lies ahead. Real faith requires courage. It requires us to be willing to step into the unknown, trusting that the God who calls us forward will also guide and protect us along the way. Here's the beautiful paradox. While it's frightening to step out without knowing every detail, it's also liberating because we're releasing control and letting God take the lead. Take, for example, Peter walking on the water. When Jesus called him out of the boat, Peter didn't have a full explanation. He didn't have a roadmap or even a sense of how it was all going to work. All he had was a command from Jesus. Come. Now, Peter could have stayed in that boat. He could have let fear paralyze him, reasoning that it was safer to stay where he was. But instead, he chose to trust the one who was calling him. And so he stepped out, placing his feet on the waves, defying all human logic. In that moment, Peter experienced the miraculous. He walked on water, not by his own power, but by the power of Jesus. But we all know what happened next. When Peter took his eyes off Jesus and looked instead at the waves and the storm around him, he began to sink. Friends, that's what happens to us, too, when we let fear and doubt distract us from the one who calls us. But here's the beautiful part. Even when Peter began to sink, Jesus was there, immediately reaching out His hand, lifting him up and restoring him. This is a picture of God's grace for us, His assurance that even when we falter, He is always right there to catch us. So, what does this mean for us today? It means that stepping out in faith is not about having all the answers. It's about having confidence in the one who does. Sometimes God will call us to take a step without showing us the whole staircase. He asks us to take that first step, and as we do, He reveals the next, and then the next. We may not understand every twist and turn along the way, but as we walk in obedience, we will see His hand guiding and providing and providing. There will be times when the storms rise up, when the waters look too deep and our footing feels uncertain. But in those moments, God is teaching us to keep our eyes on Him, to trust that His power is greater than any wave, His presence is closer than any storm, and His promises are stronger than any doubt. Look at Abraham's obedience when God called him to leave his homeland. He didn't have a map or a detailed itinerary. All he knew was that God had said, go. And so he went, not knowing where he was going, but fully trusting in the one who had called him. Abraham's faith was not passive. It was active, demonstrated through his willingness to leave behind everything familiar, to let go of his comfort and security, and to step out into a future that was unknown to him, but perfectly known to him, but perfectly known to God. This is the kind of faith God desires in us. A faith that is willing to say yes to him, even when we don't have all the answers. And when we step out in obedience, God meets us there. He doesn't leave us to figure it all out on our own. No, he walks with us, guiding us, providing for us, and blessing us in ways we couldn't have imagined. But let's be honest. Obedience is not always easy. It requires us to surrender our will, to lay down our own plans and desires, and to choose God's way over our own. It requires humility, willingness to admit that we don't know what's best for ourselves, and a trust that God's plan is greater than anything we could devise. This is where many of us struggle, isn't it? We want to trust God, but we also want to hold on to our own plans, our own ideas of how things should be. Yet true obedience requires us to let go of that control, to place our dreams, our hopes, and our desires into God's hands, believing that He will take them and turn them into something far more beautiful than we could have imagined. And here's the promise. When we obey, God rewards our faithfulness. We see this throughout Scripture. When the Israelites followed God's instructions, even in seemingly small and strange ways, like marching around the walls of Jericho 7 times, God showed up and did the miraculous. When Naaman obeyed the prophet Elisha and dipped himself 7 times in the Jordan River, even though it seemed foolish, God healed him. When the disciples left everything to follow Jesus, they found a life richer and more meaningful than anything they had known. In each of these stories, obedience was the key that unlocked God's blessings and His power. Friends, I believe God is calling each of us to a deeper level of obedience. He's asking us to trust Him more fully, to surrender more completely, and to step out in faith even when we don't have all the answers. He's inviting us to let go of our fears and our need for control, to place our lives into His capable hands, and to walk in the assurance that He will never lead us astray. It's not always easy, but the blessings that come from walking in obedience to God are worth every sacrifice, every step of faith, and every act of surrender. So today, I encourage you to examine your own life. Is there an area where God is calling you to step out in faith, to trust Him more deeply, to obey even when it's hard? Maybe He's asking you to forgive someone who has hurt you, to take a new path in your career, to give more generously, or to share your faith with someone. Whatever it is, know that He doesn't ask you to obey in your own strength. He is with you, empowering you, guiding you, and leading you into a future that is beyond anything you could imagine. When we obey God, when we step out in faith, we position ourselves to receive His blessings and to experience His power in ways we never thought possible. And remember this, obedience is not just about what we do. It's about who we become. As we follow God's call, He is shaping us, transforming us, and drawing us closer to Himself. We become people of faith, people of courage, people who are willing to go wherever He leads, because we know that He is good, that He is faithful, and that His plans for us are always right. Trust and obey. those two words carry the weight of God's promises. They are the foundation of a life that is fully surrendered, fully alive, and fully blessed in the hands of the Almighty. As we come to the end of our time together, I want to bring you back to this central truth. God's plan is truly beyond what you can imagine. Every one of us has dreams, desires, and hopes for our lives, but so often we limit ourselves by focusing only on what we can see, only on what we can see, only on what seems possible in our own strength. But God, in His infinite wisdom, doesn't work within the boundaries we place on ourselves. He has a plan for each of us that is far greater, richer, and more profound than anything we could ever conceive on our own. His ways are higher, His thoughts are deeper, and His love for us is boundless. The journey He has set before you isn't meant to be predictable or easy, but it is a path that leads to growth, purpose, and fulfillment beyond your wildest dreams. And this journey with God requires something significant from each of us: trust, obedience, and a willingness to step forward even when the road isn't fully clear. So today I want to invite you to respond to this truth personally. This isn't just about hearing a message. It's about making a choice. It's about deciding right here and now to trust God more deeply, to let go of the need to control every detail, and to open your heart to the possibility that He has a plan for you that is more extraordinary than anything you've ever dared to imagine. Maybe you're feeling unsure. Maybe you're facing uncertainty. Maybe you're in the middle of a season where nothing seems to make sense. Let me remind you that God is with you. He hasn't abandoned you, and He hasn't forgotten you. In fact, He is right there in the midst of your circumstances, working all things together for your good and for His glory. All He asks is that you surrender to Him, that you trust Him, and that you follow where He leads. As we conclude, I want to give you a challenge, a call to action that goes beyond these words. If you're struggling with fear or doubt, if you're holding on to plans, that you know God is asking you to release, I encourage you to lay them down before Him. Take a moment to pray and ask God to help you trust Him more fully. And if there's an area in your life where God has been prompting you to step out in faith, to forgive someone, to serve, to give, or to go, whatever it may be, I challenge you to act on that prompting today. Don't wait. Don't let fear or uncertainty hold you back from experiencing the fullness of God's blessing. Remember, obedience is the gateway to God's promises. When we step forward in faith, even when we don't understand, we place ourselves right in the center of His will, and that is the safest, most fulfilling place we could ever be. And I want to encourage you to share this journey with someone. You don't have to walk this path alone. Find a friend, a mentor, or a fellow believer and share what God is doing in your heart. There is power in community, and when we share our journeys of faith, we encourage one another, we build each other up, and we become stronger together. We were never meant to walk this road alone, and God often uses others to help guide and support us along the way. Today, as we close, let's commit together to trust God's plan for our lives. Let's choose to believe that He is working, even in the waiting, even in the trials, even in the moments that seem to make no sense. Let's choose to keep our eyes fixed on Him, to walk forward with courage, and to live in anticipation of the amazing things He has in store. Because when we truly surrender our lives to Him, when we place our trust in His hands, We will see His goodness in ways we could never have imagined. We will experience His faithfulness. We will know His peace. And we will live lives that reflect His glory. So wherever you are, whatever you're facing, remember this: God is for you. He is with you. And He has a purpose for you that is greater than you can comprehend. Trust in His timing. Walk in obedience. And hold on to hope, knowing that the God who began a good work in you will be faithful to complete it. Let's pray together and commit ourselves to His plan, believing that He is able to do far more abundantly than all we ask or think, according to the power at work within us.